Excuse me for just one moment. I know. Back just a minute. Anyway, we're going to start back where we left off, and we're reading The Amazing World of Kreskin, and we're in the section of the power of suggestion, and we're going to start here on chapter 4. On a summer's night long ago, at the Brant's Beach Yacht Club in New Jersey, I told the subjects on stage that they would see flying saucers. A portion of the sky was visible. I was performing on the screened-in yacht club porch. Soon, a number of the subjects saw unidentified flying objects skirting the heavens. Several ran to phones and were convincing enough to call out both the police and fire departments. The aftermath was rather embarrassing. Explanation of this sort of thing to police tend to be awkward. At any rate, much later, I could truthfully answer Dr. J. Allen Hydick's professor of astronomy at Northwestern University when he contacted me about this area of the suggestibility phenomenon. He was scheduled to speak on UFOs before a science convention and had certain questions about the possibility of suggestion weighing heavily in some flying saucer sightings. Highly regarded in his field, Dr. Hydick was involved in tracking Sputnik, the first Soviet space satellite for the United States government, and has since devoted much time to UFO research. The astronomer has a theory that if UFOs have approached this planet, they might possibly be coming through from another galaxy, not within our universe, and that these intelligences are passing through, perhaps accidentally, perhaps exploring. His theory was previously advanced by the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, a large private group of prominent aviation figures. The community includes aircraft pilots as well as space scientists. Accepting the fact that a certain percentage of sightings by reputable people of sound mind, mostly experienced pilots, cannot be explained, and Dr. Hendrick believes that the large majority of sightings are completely false and doubts that any UFO has ever landed on the Earth planet. In this, he agrees with the scientific study of unidentified flying objects. The report of an Air Force-sponsored commission headed by Dr. Edward C. Condor, professor of physics at the University of Colorado. Findings of the careful Condor Commission indicated that the overwhelming majority of reported sightings could be explained by visual distortions of completely normal aerial activity. aircraft and weather balloons to test atmospheric conditions. Illusion was given its due. Fantasy and pure invention figured into the tens of thousands of flying saucer incidents. Predictably, the Canton report was ignored by a host of UFO buffs and the nut fringe of the occult. Nothing could be more tailor-made for the occultists than the Martians in silver suits scooting about in saucers and portholed shiny metallic sausages from Saturn. Hynek was interested in the cognition of sightings, possibly prompted by self-suggestion or guided suggestibility, as occurred in the famous Orson Welles radio program of the 1930s. He was also interested in the interaction of groups under such conditions. I agreed that a small percentage of the sightings might possibly be explained or could be identified in psychological terms and offered to stage a sighting for his observation. He came up to TV station CJOH in Ottawa, where I taped my syndicated show on a selected night. Conditioning 14 subjects, I told them that when we went to black for the commercial, they would return to the audience, dress warmly, and then proceed outside the studio. Cameras had been set up outdoors, one of which would monitor the demonstration for the studio audience. I assured the subjects that when I came out and dropped the handkerchief, they would see 3 flying objects. Assisting in the test was news director Max Keepling from CJOH. His job was to interview the subjects on camera before and during the sightings. Along with Hynek and the studio audience, I watched the subjects as we went to black for the commercial break. They dutifully returned to their seats, collected coats and gloves, and then filed out into the night where Keeping was waiting. He began to question them about UFOs, and most expressed great skepticism. I watched for a moment and then went outdoors to join them. Dr. Heinrich following. The night was clear, icy cold, stars were out. Mingling with them near the reporter, I pulled out the handkerchief, wiped my forehead with it, and then dropped it. In a few seconds, the 14 subjects were sighting 3 flying saucers, pointing up and disgusting them with Keeping. Skepticism had vanished. One man rushed back into the studio, asking permission to use the phone to report UFOs. Studio personnel, briefed on what was occurring, refused his request. He returned outside bitterly, denouncing the studio employees for their apathy. I then said in a loud voice that it appeared to me that one of the saucers was descending and that it would probably hover over the station within a few minutes. 2 of the subjects began running across the snowy field toward the highway. I yelled, "Release," and they turned back. The other 12 subjects responded to the same signal. Keeping began asking them about the saucers. Informally, the subjects either laughed at him or questioned his sanity. No one had seen flying saucers. Dr. Hynek was very interested to know exactly what they had seen. We all returned inside out of sub-freezing weather, and I suggested that the 14 subjects back into their imaginative mental discovery. They responded in considerable detail, including descriptions of shapes and designs of the UFOs. The colors varied. Some saw yellow saucers, some saw green. Notably, no subject saw more than 3 saucers, the exact number I had suggested. Later that night, the astronomer concluded that suggestibility had played a much larger role in UFO sightings where more than one person was involved than previously thought. People had hallucinated saucers or huge mental cigars. It was not a distortion of reality, but a sighting of nothing. What triggered the hallucination? The answer to that would be as complex as any Martian visitor. In case of the 14 subjects in Ottawa, they responded in the heat of the experiment and afterward, but in a comparatively short time, they would have realized what had happened, as well as with all cases of suggestibility. The psychodrama keyed by suggestion is never permanent. Individuals who continue to report private instances with UFOs as though selected by that other intelligence as contact person for the Earth planet have to be suspect. There is no physical evidence to back up their sightings. The attention given to them or the commitment made to themselves on the initial sightings probably forced them on. Nonetheless, they are quite capable of contagion within a group as is the person who genuinely hallucinates and genuinely believes he has spotted a spaceship from another galaxy. Chapter 5. Other than Adolf Hitler's madness, one of the first and most dramatic examples of mass suggestibility in modern times is Orson Welles' Mercury Theater radio presentation, The War of the Worlds, first performed on October 30th, 1938, over the CBS network. Only on radio could the War of the Worlds have created such mass hysteria. Only the genius of a Welles relating the functional landing of a Martian spaceship in New Jersey could have made it work. The realism of his script and presentation combined with sound effects played directly into ready and willing imaginations. The people who actually began to believe that the United States had been invaded from another planet were not naive or particularly gullible. Those who had no doubts at all, convinced that bloopless, sulfuric heads were among us, simply possessed a greater degree of imagination. They included college professors and newspaper men. Obviously, people turned in late were more receptive. Listening to the tapes a few minutes into the show, I got the feeling that it was a live news broadcast, which, for the sake of realism, was Welles' intent. The "you are there" technique is an image stimulant. To reconstruct briefly Wells' control of human imagination that night, and I doubt he began any idea of the frontier he crossed or the silent machinery of suggestibility that he activated, there was a readiness for acceptance. It had been a dull run of weeks and months, and historically, incidents of this sort usually take place in times of dogma. Besides, a certain amount of unplanned conditioning had occurred. Imaginations and natural curiosity had been whetted over the years by articles in newspapers and such magazines as Popular Mechanics and Popular Science, by elaborate and imaginative drawings of spaceships and Martians by Buck Rogers, and pulp science fiction. The moon and the other planets were visible, possibly inhabited by creatures. A key element by this time was that man was flying. He could even fly from continent to continent. Witness Charles Lindbergh. Beyond that, who knew projection then as now was not difficult. So, when a fictitious reporter, mic in hand, approached the spaceship in New Jersey to give an on-the-spot description broadcast, remote from where it was all happening, the elements of suggestibility were lined up like psychic cars in a midnight train. Any gaps could be filled, even expanded, by average and normal imagination. As the reporter got closer and closer, describing the intense heat, gasping and finally losing his voice, no wonder a portion of the audience swallowed Martians and swallowed hard. Suddenly, there was dead silence, and then Wells, at master control back at the station, said, "Come in, come in. Where are you?" That capped it. One listener, later interviewed by the New York Daily Times, had climbed to the roof of a low building and described events that were taking place across the river to an odd crowd gathered below. "I see the lights increasing and some more have landed. He cannot be faulted. He was not an idiot, nor was he gullible. In his mind, he saw those lights. He saw more spaceships landing. Without doubt, he was stimulated by the crowd below because he began to serve a role in the entire psychodrama. Suggestibility speaking, his imagination was reinforced by the crowd, and consequently, he saw more of the events in New Jersey from his Manhattan rooftop as he went along. That Wells did not really know the possible consequences of stepping across onto an unknown plane comparatively larger than Earth itself was demonstrated both that evening and later. I remember awakening one early school day in the 40s and listening to President Robinson on the New York WOR, and announced that the War of the Worlds had been recreated the previous night in Venezuela. At broadcast in, the listeners were informed it was only fiction. Their fright and then their rage ended with the burning of the station and the death of two announcers. Another and different example of group suggestibility comes from my own home. I was a small child when I first heard my father's story of the headless man. And since he was not changed a word of it, not even an inflection in 30 years, I take it to be true. The truth lies in what he thought he saw. With two teenage friends, my father went to visit a relative in a nearby town in Pennsylvania. They walked the distance of about 12 miles since they didn't have a car or horse. During the afternoon, they were warned to leave well before dark. Otherwise, they might meet the headless man on the bridge en route home. This warning had been issued on other visits, but my father had never heeded it. Neither had he ever crossed the bridge at night. The boys laughed it off, and it was almost dark when they started for home. By the time they reached the bridge, it was total night. Walking abreast, the two friends to my father's left, they were talking about things, but it is obvious they were mindful unconsciously of what they might encounter. My father then began aware of a sound or vibration to his right and looked. Keeping precise pace with them was a man dressed in black and seemingly devoid of a head. My father glanced to his left and saw that his friends were running across the bridge, having already spotted the night walker. My father ran too. He maintains that he did see the headless man, and his friends, one of them still living, firmly backs him up. I don't deny that they saw something, but the picture, in my opinion, was sent from the unconscious, similar to my own reception of an image over a darkened theater or on the surface of a glass of water. Unless a farmer was playing a prank, my father and his friends had suffered momentarily group hallucination. It is not uncommon, though sometimes frightening is the phenomenon. Chapter number 6. People are suggestible in different settings. A scientist may not be suggestible in an auditorium, but may be very receptive when he is alone or in close rapport with a single person. An actress, on the other hand, capable of great flights of imagination, can be carried away in the midst of thousands. Emotions, of course, play a part. They lend to suggestibility. The emotional Sieg Heil at SS rallies in Germany were like waves mounting in a storm, pushed by the winds of suggestion, crashing higher and higher. The skilled controller can manipulate them as if they were musical instruments. Exactly what part of suggestibility played in unleashing Hitler's madness cannot be easily determined. However, the estimate is considerable. Beyond his ability as a spellbinding speaker, he apparently understood the power of suggestion and how to use it to sway millions, bringing them to the roaring Sieg Heil. 2. He knew something of hypnotic techniques, having sat in on more than 200 demonstrations. The average person, unless interested in the field or making a clinical study, would not attend more than a dozen sessions in a lifetime. Hitler's early tutor was a German expert named Erich von Hansen, who was reportedly liquidated in 1934. Hansen was an intriguing man with a long criminal record. He was a noted entertainer, columnist, soothsayer, clairvoyant, opera producer, songwriter, and counselor to some of the Nazi social elite. In the moments before Hitler took power, Hansen's astrology column repeatedly predicted the coming of the Messiah, though he didn't name the house painter as Germany's new savior. Once Hitler emerged, Hansen began to predict events of the Nazi Party in various cities. I'm going to stop there for a second. Hello?
Hi. Hello,
Yeah,
Robert.
can you, what's on your mind?
Never mind.
Hansen was an intriguing man with a long criminal record. He was noted entertainer, columnist, soothsayer, clairvoyant, opera producer, songwriter, and counselor to some of the Nazi social elite. In the months before Hitler took power, Hansen astrology column reported predicted the coming of the Messiah, though he didn't name the house painter as Germany's new savior. Once Hitler emerged, Hansen began to predict events of the Nazi Party in various cities, days or even hours before they would occur. Those accurate prophecies are not too surprising, since he was privy to many secrets, and his predictions appeared to have been followed a careful plan. Soon they proved fatal to the seer. Because of his knowledge, influence, and prestige, Hansen was a target on June 30th of 1934 in a quiet country setting. Other executions of dangerous people were carried out that same night in Berlin and Bolivia. Hansen had served his purpose. Although I don't understand German, a certain attention holding cadence can be established in listening to tapes of Hitler's voice. In films of his speeches, either by day or night, objects that reflect light can be seen behind him. I doubt that they were there by accident. As the speeches mount, lights catch them. They flash. Hitler was the central controller, using mass suggestibility that eventually made armies roll across Europe. It is tragic that many of the dynamic figures of history have been dictator types, and that many have employed the techniques of mass suggestibility, coming by it naturally or guided by experts. A current model in world politics, almost paralleling Hitler, is pervasive, is Cuba's Fidel Castro. After a Manhattan concert in which I described Castro's techniques as extremely suggestible, capable of holding people in a verbal palm, a New York Times reporter, a Cuban, came backstage to say, "I know exactly what you mean. I listened to him one day in the square in Havana and didn't realize until he had finished that I had been standing there almost 5 hours and was completely soaked from rain. That night, I've had subjects on stage for an hour and 10 minutes, but they thought they had only been up there for 5 minutes. They were not in a trance. They'd been awake as the time reporters was, as Hitler's audience were, as well as radio listeners were. The time distortion, the acceptance of lies and Martians, was the result of being trapped in an imaginative response. The response can easily be turned physical. During the period of the great religious revivals that began in the United States around 1804, yeah, can you hear me?
Hello?
Yeah,
Can you talk now?
actually, I'm recording something on the computer, and it's going to go on the air. So can I call you back in about 15 minutes?
I just wanted to tell you I'm going to go to the post office with you at 10.
Okay.
Can we go at 10?
Yeah, as soon as I'm done here, we can go.
Okay.
All right, love you, see ya.
I love you, Robert.
I love you too, girl.
I figured out what I did with my books.
Well, that's good. I'm glad.
Okay, I love you.
All right, girl. Love you, see ya.
Love you, see ya.
I apologize for the interruption, and we will continue somewhere where I left off. All right, that night I'd had subjects on stage for an hour and 10 minutes, but they thought they had only been up there for 5 minutes. They were not in a trance. They'd been awake, as the Times reporter was, as Hitler's audiences were, as well as radio listeners were. The time distortion, the acceptance of lies and Martians, was the result of being trapped in an imaginative response. The response can easily be turned physical during the period of the great religious revivals that began in the United States around 1804. Many participants, particularly in Tennessee and Kentucky, fell to the ground, apparently senseless, while listening to the preacher. Another form of the epic hysteria was the jerking exercise, which began with the arms and then extended to the neck and shoulders. A third variety that appeared at the revivals were the whirling exercises, in which the carried away sinners whirled like tops. It would begin with one or two participants and then spread throughout the open air meetings. Response to suggestion is at the bottom of the religious manifestations of the holy rollers, the shakers, and the new lights. In 1922, a massive hysterical response occurred at a high school in North Carolina. Cadence were parading on a hot spring afternoon and 4 keeled over. Several girls then fainted in the grandstand. Before the suggested reaction ran its bizarre course, an estimated 60 people had toppled. In the broadest spectrum, involving both mental and physical responses with all its potential for good, guided suggestibility or suggestiology, has the potential for incomparable paralyzing evil when used to sway masses. The Chicago riots at the 1968 Democratic Convention did not just happen, neither did the riots at Kent State University. They were guided by central control of agitators expertly using the power of suggestion. The crowds, after a point, were unknowingly responding in a hyper-suggestible manner. They were wide awake, functioning normally in every sense except that of a rational mind. Most of the high school and college students in both places will at first angrily deny any psychic influence simply because they were not aware of the careful and gradual mind conditioning that had been taken place. They were particularly aware of the inciting keywords being used by roughly 24 organizers or controllers, most of them men in their 50s. During the 4 days of Chicago, some rather old but still sophisticated conditioning techniques were employed. Although they were outwardly the pictures of innocence, youthful exuberance, and pleasure, mixed in with the rock music, dancing, and some use of narcotic stimulants, were key inflammatory phrases, mind plants that would blow out the proper moments. Mass movement, heat, noise, and racing pulses need little but the power of suggestion in any setting to produce mob reactions. Dancing has long been used as a conditioner. The war dances of the American Indian were not intended to calm the braves. They were drummed out for the more efficient use of the tomahawk. African tribal dances are often purely suggestive. In more than a sexual sense, long ago they were used to psych up the warriors prior to battle to build morale and a single-minded purpose. Football pep rallies have much the same purpose. Some of the marches in Chicago were stubble conditioners, were notable for the chanting of key suggestive phrases such as, chiefly, get the pigs. Other marches, in contrast, were subdued and non-suggestive, probably indicating that no ultra-militant controller was in line. Similar to dancing, marches provide a mass body generating a unified instrument which can be, if purposely programmed, used for mind control. Introduction of a symbolic chant tends to bind the masses. The ho 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 ching ming of the Chicago streets, an important from German student demonstrators, was symbolic rather than suggestive. As to phrasing in any type of conquest, football, or war, or riots, there may not be enough time for critical thought, so numbers of symbolic words are substituted to ignite a spontaneous reaction. In the case of some disturbances, current and years back, reaction was not spontaneous. It all as it affected the subjects, or properly the victims, it was programmed. Once the conditioning is accomplished and the mob ignited, the job of the professional controller is to sustain the riot action by continued use of the power of suggestion, moving in to toss more verbal nabble where the emotional fires are dying out. Central control is necessary. Without it, few riots will last longer than several hours. Like an explosion, they tend to splash to the outer part of the human circle, diminishing in intensity. As part of a study of mass psychology, narrowing eventually to mob control, done as a personal interest, I interviewed numerous students who were involved at Kent State. I also talked to a number involved in Chicago. Roughly one half of my appearances each year are on college campuses, and most times there is a lively give and take bull session after the concerts. But having this weekly, monthly contact with students, I could not clearly understand the sudden shift to violence in 1968 and 1969. I did make a guess that some of it had to be controlled. The President's Commission and others, independent reports affirm there had been intense tension in the Kent State community long before the actual outbreak. On occasion, it had reached the point of terror. Sometimes baskets of broken glass were dumped on the heads of pedestrians, setting the stage for counter-reaction. Before it peaked, the conditioners employed the dancing rock music and key wordings of Chicago. The results, of course, were tragic, but in my findings, they were predictable and inevitable as long as the conditioners and the controllers were permitted to operate. To deny them that right is another matter, perhaps without solution. Yet, as one who professionally practices suggestibility and knows its power, I tend to agree with Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes that no one has the right to yell fire in a crowded theater if there is none. The situations are parallel. Civil liberties are involved in both. After fomenting experimental riots on college stages, using only the power of suggestion to create the climate for violence, simply to prove a point, I've had students come backstage to say, "Now I know what you mean when you say suggestive techniques were used in Chicago or Kent State. I was there and I see the similarity in approach." This does not mean that the students were not willing, even desirous of participation, of gladly joining in violence. It does mean that the emotions of the participants were calculatedly programmed and that many of their responses were totally uncritical. The students were, in brief, used. I'm fully aware of the peace movement passions and issues involved, of the bitter disappointments, of the purpose and the steadfast beliefs. I'm sympathetic to them. Yet, as a steady practitioner in the use of the power of suggestion, I also know that Chicago, Kent State, Berkeley, and other examples of student disruption that led to self-defeating violence could not have occurred without programmed incitement. The high school march on Mayor Lindsay's office in New York did not just happen on the spur of the moment. The late Senator Everett Dixon was quoted. Some of the men in that group were the same faces as in Chicago. Following the August 1970 meeting of the State University executives in Chicago, a meeting called specifically to exchange information on campus tensions and the fall semester outlook, the Associated Press quoted an identified top administrator of a large Midwestern university as saying, "I think it is clear to us that there are a bunch of pros at work, cynically manipulating our students. Compared to them, we're a bunch of amateurs. If they want to shut us down, they can." The candid admission that the universities could be shut down was frightening, but manipulation by power of suggestion is almost unbeatable if those responding are unaware of the techniques. Traditional and increasing targets for radical movement campus present both comparatively easy access to masses and the open-mindedness of the young. They also usually have one or more professors in residence who sincerely believe in one or more radical causes. They gladly espouse, if not promote, their cause. Academic freedom must continue to assure opportunities to air any cause, far left or far right. However, to maintain that freedom on campus or off, students and faculty may not have to learn some hard facts about the science of suggestibility. Its negative and explosive factors, at least Nazi Germany, is a lesson. Excuse me. Appearing at an Eastern university in 1969, I was quickly made aware of a movement being manipulated largely by an off-campus non-student group that was gathering momentum toward violence. My estimated audience that evening would number about 3,000, and the administration warned that they might be an attempt to use the mass gathering for other purposes. In defense alone, I decided to discuss some of the negative factors of suggestibility and demonstrate the role of controllers. I think the point hit home. A number of the demonstrators were present, but no attempt was made to take over the stage or the mic. Coupled with the negative factors of suggestibility, it strongly appeared that all people tend to lose some degree of responsibility in a mob, feeling that they can eventually put the blame on those around them. They become less a part of the decisive factors. Obviously, the conditions or controllers take advantage of this protective correlation. Not long ago, a New York psychiatrist decided to conduct an experiment on individual response as compared to the multiple response in an incident situation. He placed an ad offering a job and then used his office as a lab. It contained several chairs and couches in addition to a secretary's desk. A focal point was an overhead vent used for heating and air conditioning. At a precise moment, smoke was fed through the vent. When one applicant was present, he rose immediately to tell the secretary that there might be a fire in the building. When two applicants were present, it took a longer time for them to warn of possible danger. When five were present, none got up immediately. In fact, several pretended they didn't notice the smoke, taking on protective correlation. Dr. Freud appears to have been correct when he noted that man has a sheep-like quality on occasion, seeming to respond to a herd when grouped together. Control is possible with the emergence of a leader. One person in the room with a smoking vent assumed leadership, before others would no doubt have responded immediately, "Yes, I do see smoke." In riot, cause, and control, Congress might do better spending a few dollars on a handful of books written in the 1980s or the 1880s and 1890s than appropriating mass expenditures for commissions and investigations after the fact. Dr. Boris Snides, with his Psychology of Suggestion, Dr. Hippolyte Bernstein, with Suggestions Therapist, Dr. E.W. Scripture of Yale University with the Power of Direct Suggestion, as well as Ivan Pavlik of Russia, Albert Moll of Germany, and Otto G. Weatherstrain of Sweden, all explored mass human reactions almost 100 years ago, and the facts remain the same. They are more explosive today because there are more of us around, usually very prone to suggestion. As a dominating force in our lives, suggestion won't go away, politically or otherwise, as advertising based mainly on suggestibility and persuasion in all its visual and aerial forms. We wake up with it and we go to bed with it. As with all communications, it is open to devious use. And Ferber several years back over subliminal advertising was warranted if only for the purpose of investigation. The idea behind it was reprehensible, flashing almost imperceivable designs or words on movie or TV screens to influence buyers was an unparalleled concept in deceit. The possibility that it might suggest dominating millions silently was almost too staggering to contemplate. It was first tried in drive-in theaters, where the word popcorn, fitting indeed, was projected subliminally. Some reports indicate that the sales were increased. Then it was discovered that many of the theater operators had moved their vending machines into more prominent positions to take full advantage of this new, low, in-friendly persuasion. Finally, one operator raised the sensibility question: is the sales increase result of subliminal hucksteering or better position of the poppers? The latter was indicated. The New Jersey was the first state legislatively to ban subliminal advertising, and then all the networks banded it, practicing another type of mass hysteria. After the initial outcry was over, psychiatrists looked into selling by flash perception. There was no concrete evidence that the customer bought because of the flash, if he ever saw it. Yet, the Orwellian attempt remains as a clear warning against tinkering with the public forms of communication for the purposes of mass persuasion. Suggestibility also has its 1984 aspects in the hands of an expert. And that should do it for today. We'll come back on Thursday with Chapter 7. I found the section that we were reading today, except for the few interruptions, was very interesting and very suggestive, in a sense, that you might say, and that I'm looking forward to starting with Chapter 7 on Thursday And I hope everybody enjoyed it. I hope that you will return and enjoy more of my reading. And I also pray that all of you will have a great and wonderful day and everything will be fine in your world. And thank you very much for coming. And I'll see you on Thursday. Bye bye.